Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session of Humanism in Practice. I'm Jyoti Bachani. I'm a professor at St. Mary's College of California, co-founder of the US and India chapters of International Humanistic Management Association. I want to begin with a thank you for the International Humanistic Management Association for allowing us this space to gather together. And thank you to Ariane for getting us all set up for us to be able to be together this morning. I will start with an introduction to the two speakers, Steve and Matt. After that, they will present for about 25 minutes, and then it will be time for an interactive dialogue. We will close the session at 10 a.m. my time, which is exactly an hour. Let me begin with the introductions. The speakers today are Professor Steve Taylor and Professor Matt Statler. Professor Taylor is a professor of leadership and creativity at Worcester Polytechnic Business School. His research is focused in two areas, organizational aesthetics and reflective practice. In organizational aesthetics, he's the founder of the Organizational Aesthetics Journal that has been an open source journal since 2012. He's also the editor. In that field of research, he applies art-based scholarship and practice to management and organizations. And on the reflective practice, he helps people and himself, I guess, as well, ability to analyze our own actions and learn how to be more effective, ethical, and artful as managers and leaders. His research has been published in journals including Organizational Studies, Leadership Quarterly, Leadership, Academy of Management Learning and Education, and Journal of Management Studies. He has authored several books, Leadership Craft, Leadership Art, Staging Organization, Plays as Critical Commentaries on Workplace Life, Becoming a Leader You Want to Be Using Reflective Practice, for Root Cause Analysis in the Craft of Leadership, and Confessions of a Reluctant Leader and Other Musings from Organizational Aesthetics. He's also a playwright. His plays have been performed in England, France, Poland, Canada, Denmark, New Zealand, Italy, Australia, and United States. He received his PhD in management from Boston College, an MA in performing arts from Emerson College, and a BS in humanities from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Matt Statler is the Richmond Family Director of Business Ethics and Social Impact Programming and a clinical professor of business and society at NYU Stern School of Business. Previously, Matt served as NYU's Center for Catastrophe Preparedness and Response as the Director of Research and Associate Director of the International Center for Enterprise Preparedness. He worked as the Director of Research at the Imagination Lab Foundation in Switzerland, following several years as a management consultant in New York City. His research on wisdom, play, ethics, leadership, and strategy has been published in dozens of peer-reviewed journals and as book chapters. He completed his PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University, spent a year as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Heidelberg, and obtained his bachelor's degree in Spanish and philosophy from University of Missouri. Steve and I have collaborated on offering professional development workshops, which some of you might have attended at the Academy of Management. And I was lucky enough to be a guest editor for the poetry special issue of Organizational Aesthetics. So our collaboration goes back several years, and it's my pleasure to present Steve and Matt. Over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jody. And thank you to the IMA, is that International Humanistic Management Association? How do we pronounce it? For inviting us. You were sort of on my list of places that I think we'd like to come to talk about this because it felt like a natural fit to me. And what we want to talk today a bit about is the field of organizational aesthetics. And this seems like a good time to do it because about 2 years ago, Edward Elgar approached me out of the blue asking if I wanted to edit a research handbook on organizational aesthetics, which I think means it's a field. And I know that almost 30 years ago, in 1996, I started doing the background, the research for my PhD. And I realized I wanted to do it in aesthetics and organizational aesthetics. There were six articles that I could find in the world. One of them was in a like top tier journal, and the other five were in this very obscure little journal. But it didn't exist hardly at all. There was like one or two books, some practitioner work, but there really wasn't much there, which made it, in that sense, a whole lot easier to do the lit review. But so now here we are, 30 years after that, and we have created, and we're in the position where we went to go create this research handbook, and it has about 40 chapters. And it was actually difficult to get it down to 40 because there were so many people working in the field. There were enough other people out there that we didn't talk to that we could do a whole nother one with a whole nother set of people if we wanted. So it really kind of extraordinary. And my first step on this was to find a co-editor. And so I immediately turned to Matt because Matt and I have written together. I met Matt in 2002 at the Art of Management and Organization Conference in London. We stayed in touch since then. Said we've written a few articles together, and Matt for me was everything I needed in a co-editor, which was someone who sees things enough alike, but also enough different to be useful, easy to work with, who I'd worked with before, and logistically was in the same time zone. So all that, you know, little things like that really actually end up making quite a bit of difference. And one of the first things we decided was we didn't want to be editors. We wanted to curate this. It was about aesthetics. We wanted to curate the handbook. And we've convinced Elgar that that's what we are, that we are curators, not editors, which meant, I think, a fundamentally different approach to how we did things. Editing for me would have been more about kind of closing down and controlling, and curating was much more about opening up and encouraging people to push out their boundaries and go into their wildest kind of interesting things and push them into places where they maybe weren't comfortable. And I think the result of that is we now have just within the last week finally gotten everything to Elgar, all the files and everything. And so it should come out sometime in the spring. And we thought a good way to kind of talk about it was to talk about the content of this handbook a bit. And we've kind of divided it up into different sort of ideas that we think are important. And I'll turn it over to Matt if you want to take on the start of this.
Sure, Steve. Thanks. And again, thanks, Jyoti, Ariana, and all others here present. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you, Ariana. I didn't look back. I've connected with this group once before. It was in the pandemic, and so it was another one of those Blur's Day in Zoom land things at some point a few years ago. So it's nice to be back in and among you. Maybe what I can do as a lead-in to this slide, and also to sort of echo or you know, yeah, respond to Steve's introduction. My background, yeah, I got a PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt, and then thought I was going to be a philosopher, and then surprise, surprise, there was nobody hiring Deleuzian Platonists anywhere, and I was living in New York City with my then girlfriend, now still wife, and didn't want to leave the city, and so I became, under duress, I became a management consultant, and then some friends back in Tennessee had a .com startup consultancy, and they wanted somebody to open up an office in New York City, and so we rode that first .com wave, 99, 2000 or so, and in that context, we were among the first people who were trained to facilitate a process called Lego Serious Play that had been developed by some management educators working in Switzerland in collaboration with the Lego company. So using Lego bricks as a medium for a process of strategy making with teams of executives. In that initial phase, it was in .com execs. Then the .com wave crashed and I was out of a job. But they were hiring in Switzerland. And so I moved to Switzerland to the Imagination Lab Foundation, where I worked for 4 years playing. And to the extent that this is a humanistic humanism in practice, I want to just really just emphasize that the the playfulness, the capacity of the playful dimension of our humanity was my full-time job then there in those 4 years. And it was in that context, yes, that I met Steve. The field of sort of organizational aesthetics, the art of management and organizations conferences were happening at that time. And this has been kind of one of the tribes that I've been running with the whole time since then. So to have this occasion with Steve to curate this handbook and to reach back out to many of the fellow travelers that we've met along the way, also to meet the new people who have entered this field as it has grown, has been just an incredible pleasure and honor. So I'm honored to be speaking with you about it here today. The slide here, this is one of, I guess, 4 or 5 slides like this, categories of chapters in the handbook. All of these bullet points, the 5 here, are chapters in the handbook, and it'll be the same for the subsequent slides. We've grouped these chapters thematically in these categories because it's sort of our way of, like, what is the field of organization aesthetic? What do people, my kids ask me, Dad, or what are you talking about? Like, well, if you want to talk about organization aesthetics, one of the things that you're talking about that is new and distinct and perhaps different from much of the rest of what goes on in organization and management studies is you're talking about modes of knowing that involve engaging the senses. Sight, sound, touch, all how synesthetic we want to get with this discussion, but the various senses as modes, yes, of discernment and perception, also then of judgment, and so too of knowledge. The idea that the human senses, it's not that they're somehow fundamentally distinct from cognition. Cognition is woven thick with sensory knowledge, and so that's one basic set of assumptions that I think the field of organization aesthetics can be known by. So these chapters, for example, we're talking about Ralph down, talking about Leonard Bernstein, like in and through music. Timon and Robin, the notion that color, and here they're working with even like the philosophy of Goethe's theory of color, bringing color as a mode of knowing to organizations, something that hasn't really been studied at all. They're innovating in this chapter and in Timon's work. Natalie, the notion of dissonance, so an aesthetic or an acoustic metaphor, but a notion that we have a sense for consonance, harmonies, dissonance. Damien, his work, like out there ethnographically, literally sound ethnography, like with boom mics in the Dee estuary. The Dee is the river that separates Wales from the UK there, and I guess was southwest, western British Isles. And Klaus Springborg, working as a therapist and an organizational sort of psychologist and coach, talking about integrating the various senses into a set of templates that allow people to, again, to discern and perceive and to judge, and thereby also to know. All of these things relevant to organization aesthetics. Steve, next slide is yours, I believe.
Yeah, and I just would add that for me, this was the foundational place that made the original organizational aesthetics writing, like Antonio Strati and stuff, said, look, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and it gave us this whole like primacy of logic and analysis. And a century later, Baumgarten said, "Well, there's other ways of knowing. There's this sensory knowing," and he called this a study of sensory knowing aesthetics. And I think that epistemological difference, it sits right at the heart of all of the field of organizational aesthetics. So I think it's a tremendously kind of important thing. Oh, sorry, something. There we go. So one of the things we try to do in this field is, I think, because we recognize there are other ways of knowing, one of the results of that is that if you know things in a direct sensory way, typically those modes of knowing get represented through art. as opposed to that more analytic mode of knowing, which gets represented through more discursive forms like academic articles. So we have 4 chapters that are actually art pieces. Um, and I think there's real power. And I think this is a real potentially wonderful thing about the field is this idea that we can include art. Um, and I tell you, to me, there's some big differences in producing art rather than producing more scholarly works. So one of the chapters is mine, which is it's a monologue about my experience of being the interim dean of the business school for 2.5 years. And if you'd asked me what it was about, I would say, well, I'm trying to give you something of my personal experience of it, but really the kind of through line story is about the way in which there's always a crisis. And I think this is a fundamental kind of aspect of leadership we don't see a lot. I remember an interview once with Bill Clinton where they asked him what was surprising to you when you became president. And he said, I was surprised by how little time I had to actually kind of enact my agenda. Most of every day there was a new crisis or several crises, and I was responding to that. You spent most of your time responding to stuff. And I certainly didn't have a new crisis every day, but it felt like there would be a crisis. We'd work like crazy to try to respond to it. And then there'd be another crisis. And we'd work like crazy to respond to that and kind of forget about the previous one. We never resolved anything. We just seemed to move from crisis to crisis. And that's what I felt like I was writing about. And then I performed it at the Art Management and Organization Conference in last year in 2024 in Nancy. And I was doing some rehearsal with Piers Ibbotson. And after we done it, he started talking, he said, wow, so you've really captured that sense of leadership, which says that if you're a leader of a large organization for any significant amount of time, you're going to hurt people. That's part of being a leader, which I hadn't thought that's what this was about at all. But then, of course, he's right. It is about that. And of course, I'm right. It is about what I would think it's about these. There's multiple things, and art does a really good job of being able to be about multiple things and being about different things we connect to. And it wasn't. And the Piers' remark led to a discussion. We had a discussion then about the incidence of sociopathy. Why there are more sociopaths the higher up you go in an organization. And we said, well, maybe it's related to the sense that the higher up you go in an organization, the more likely you're going to have to actually hurt people as part of your job. And most of us don't like that. Most of us find that to be pretty annoying and pretty horrible. So there's, again, I've really never read anything when I read books on leadership, they don't talk about this sort of side of it, this aspect of it. And you don't get that richness of it in the way you do with good art, I think. So, I think for us, it's great. My favorite chapter, I think, in the whole book is the one Charcoal by Hunter Schadt, David Berry, because it's like 24 pages of its drawings. It's 24 pages of images, and there's drawings and text, and it brings together the Carl Weick stuff, Man Gulch disaster stuff with the January 6th stuff. January 6th protests in the US in a way that's just absolutely extraordinary for me and enriches and it also kind of captures the way in which I can't really describe to you what I get out of it, which I think is an important aspect of art. I can't always articulate. I get something, but I can't always articulate what that is. And that seems to me an important aspect of knowing. Matt, should we go on?
I started my timer here after we already started rambling, so I'm not sure where I am in terms of the time
Okay.
sequence. So I'll say
We'll
go
go
on,
down.
just because I'm curious to hear what others have to say in response. But another lens or another category of chapters in this handbook and thus in the field is then, okay, if we admit that, knowledge there's sensory knowing, and then there's art as modes of knowing, then that's about the knower. This category is about the known. So to think, okay, well, let's think about the sensory and artistic dimensions of organizational life. And we've got, as you can see, a number of chapters that explore that with food and language and, you know, buildings and architecture and sense making and craft and all kinds of stuff. Again, there's so much here. Like Steve, I'm going to choose to I'll I won't attribute vanity to you, Steve. I'll claim it for myself. I'm vainly going to flag the chapter that's mine, Sons of Astro. One other really important part of this project for me has been Steve has challenged me. He's like, Matt, you make music all the time and you write about art and aesthetics. Why not write about music? I had never done that before. I'd never tried to do that before. So the challenge for me in my chapter, Sons of Astro, is the name of a band that I play in, and to try to then take that experience of music making and music appreciation, and then to kind of extrapolate that out and to say, well, what if we viewed organizations as music? What is happening? What are the categories? The rhythm and tone and yeah, consonance, dissonance, all of these types of things, volume, pitch, using the categories of musicological analysis to focus those categories of analysis on organizations, organization forms, organization structures, the experience of people in organizations. And that's what I've done with music. It's what others here have done, with poetry and with hermeneutics and hermeneutic philosophy and gender and aesthetics and all kinds of other things, queer intervention. Chris Tyrant's great work. So again, the notion that in the field of organization aesthetics, it's about how do we know aesthetically, sensorily, and artistically. It's also then we know organizations as artistic, sensory, and aesthetic phenomena. I'd say that's all I got on that slide, Steve.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think we're actually taking longer than we're supposed to, so
Yeah.
we'll move along. The next one is kind of my home space in most of the scholarly work, which is the instrumental use of art in organizations. And it's there's a lot of stuff. The left-hand column essentially are articles or chapters that talk very specifically about using arts and arts-based methods in organizational development and in leadership development and in various forms of education. On the right-hand side, we also have 3 chapters where we're using art more broadly for the whole organization, where it's a much broader intervention rather than individual training or individual teaching. And the thing that I think comes out of this, I'm going to pick one chapter to talk about a little bit, is Giovanni Sciumma's piece, The Arts as Aesthetic Technologies. He more strongly makes the case, I think, than anyone else, that in today's world, in a world that is very VUCA, where things are ambiguous and unknown and volatile, that you need artistic sensibilities to be able to make sense of it. I mean, in some ways, I would say it's as simple as saying most of the analytic work we do kind of has this assumption that the future will look a lot like the past. That if we can figure out the past, we'll project it forward. That's what the future will be. And artists don't necessarily do that. They have a different ways. I think art is a way that we have made sense of our complex world for literally tens, not hundreds of thousands of years as humans. I think it is the fundamental human making. This more analytic method is relatively recent. Even if you go back to the Greeks or so, it's only a few thousand years where we've actually been doing that. So it's the time honored, the way we deal with complexity and unknown and make sense of things. And those artistic skills are extremely useful, extremely important. That Piers Evenson in his book, The Illusion of Leadership, his final chapter is something like why artists should rule the world or why artists should lead the world. And he's making a similar case. The skills of the arts are incredibly important now. So I'll stop there.
Well, and to say something then more about now, in the age of increased artificial intelligence and digital automation of organization tasks, the paradox, or it's a challenge and opportunity wrapped up and folded on itself. What Steve just said, like that rational cognitivist decision-making approach to knowledge, which is itself relatively recent, on Earth and in human history, we've now come to a point where if there's anything that has a known or knowable right answer, if it's a problem that's solvable, the bots can solve it faster and at scale than any of us. And so, like that, Descartes' notion of humanity is now automated. I'm not saying I believe in artificial general intelligence, but like the computational, like the rational, the problem solving, that's what the AI tools, the bots can do. And it's at this moment then that raises then question. Oh, wait a minute. What are we taught? What does it mean to be human? What is these sensory and aesthetic modes of knowledge and expression and organization? And so we've got a set of chapters in the handbook that explore that theme, which I think then leads to our final slide, Steve, which is some kind of open questions about organization studies. I just hit the fourth of these bullets. What does it mean to be human? Steve, I don't know. We thought that the fifth would be kicking it back to the audience, like, okay, in
Yeah,
the age of AI, like, what is humanism? What is humanistic management? But you want to say a few words in closing,
yeah.
Steve?
I would just say that I think if organizational aesthetics offers a lot to the world of organizational studies and management and leadership, both in terms of research and in terms of practice. And for me, I would sum it up in terms of saying that, yeah, it's important to be based in sensory experience and aesthetic judgment. Judgment has becomes a dirty word. I know my students, admittedly, I teach at an engineering school. My students are often will critique grading and say like, but you can't do that's subjective. And say, well, subjectivity is good. Judgment is important here. And in fact, you pay so much for tuition in order to receive my judgment as an expert, right? Judgment is powerful and strong, and we should embrace it again, and we should embrace subjectivity. And this pushes us into whole different issues around for quality and what matters. But it's I think critically important. I mentioned divergent generalizability. I can talk more about that later if anybody wants. And ideas that we can that actually artistic contributions are important and useful for again for practice as well as for research. So I think it gives us a different starting place from where a lot of the field is. Again, I think both in terms of research and in terms of practice. And then hopefully it maybe allows us to get past what I feel is sort of a stuckedness place in a lot of organizational studies and management these days. So I think I'm going to stop there, maybe stop sharing and turn it over to question time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Matt, thank you for sharing the evolution of your career and how you stumbled into management because philosophy, there's the joke at the school where I went about philosophy majors are being taught whether the glass is half full or half empty because the future jobs as waiters.
Never heard that one. That's good. Thank you.
That's the world we live in, and we
Yeah.
want to change that world. So that's why we have these gatherings where we can talk about these things. And I'm in the process of creating the handbook for tentatively called the eclectic research methods, but they're basically experiential ways of knowing. And it's through art, through music, through film, through contemplative methods. So I'm really pleased to hear how you worked on this handbook because that sets me up to do a better job of what I've been uh, working on for some time. So thank you for that stimulating conversation. I want to quickly have people popcorn style raise their hand and ask questions and offer their reactions. But one of the things that, in addition to saying thank you for the handbook experience and highlighting your own personal practices that led you to this work, and literally, Steve, you created the field. When I was doing improv PDWs at the Academy of Management, I had people participate who came and said, "Oh, Steve Taylor is the one who brought drama to the Academy of Management." And I realized that through drama and fiction, we can tell the truths that the world doesn't have space for. And only after Professor Jim March of Stanford passed away did I discover that he was a poet who published 11 books of poetry. And through his work, I discovered his views on poetry as theory, as allowing room for ambiguity, allowing room for complexity. And as you said, Steve, like, you don't have words, but you experience it. And poetry is something where so much is conveyed in between the lines and in between the words, in the silences and cadence and rhythm. So I've built and outed many other poets since. So it's a very, very powerful expression. So I'm really delighted that we've had this setup. But before I continue and share more about my experiences and my enthusiasm, let me turn to our listeners who have been listening patiently to please ask questions, offer your reactions.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Steve. I don't know if you pull those up. We got a hand up. Jyoti, I'll let you facilitate.
Oh, so Ravi, do you want to ask it or do you want me to read it out?
I just want to ask, a great presentation. Kudos to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. When I go to a temple in India, the ambience, it's very artistic and very sensory and so forth. And similarly, any setting, the ambient setting, has a big influence on how our mindset is kind of reconfigured or reshaped. The impact of the ambience on the mind. I think your research points to that. But I just wanted you to comment on the mechanisms and frameworks that might enable this translation of the sensory and artistic experience to strategic intent, uh, mainly focused on organizational growth strategies.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I'll take that one, Steve, if you want,
Excellent. Excellent.
because Ravi, that was it wasn't precisely or exclusively strategic intent, and it wasn't similarly like precisely or exclusively growth strategies, but the years of work on serious play at the Imagination Lab Foundation was mostly about strategy, and it was mostly about strategy making. So you know, we worked pretty hard on that, and it was again with then in that context with the initial the strategy as practice movement within strategic management studies was also kind of emerging at around that time. So questions of I mean intent, then it's issues of planning, and it's issues of like responsiveness to emergent unplanned change. My own career transition then was to go like, to work for a catastrophe preparedness place where people are dealing with unplanned change. And so how do you build resilience in the face of all possible future emergent events was kind of the approach there. I think one, I got a lot to say about that. But mechanisms or frameworks, I think the thing that I would say with sensory and artistic experience and strategic intent that is most powerful, I think it's the phenomenology of Martin Heidegger, the hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer. Those are the philosophical sources that I think would be most important to reach toward, talking about intentionality that in a way phenomenologically that integrates an awareness of the ambiance that you're talking about, going to a temple, awareness of the irreducible complexity of a moment or of a place and time, that includes, and this again, these are Heidegger's words, like a presencing or a future orientation or a historicizing orientation, that the temporality is also encapsulated in that notion of intent. My sense is that those philosophies of intentionality have yet to be fully integrated into the strategic management studies, even as scholars and colleagues and friends have pursued strategy as practice, as an approach. I think that I mean, yeah, that's where my mind goes.
Let me add just a little. I would take sort of a completely different approach to it and say, I don't think you can. I think largely in today's world, we were talking about online teaching a few years back before COVID at WPI, and I had this discussion with this trustee, and he said, we can't analyze ourselves out of this. We can't. The few things are changing too rapidly to analytically figure out what the best course of action is, then plan and go do it. And I think for strategic growth, if you're talking about trying to find those options that are not just linear continuations of the past, that are like real serious growth, big chunks, analytic techniques don't cut it. I think that's one of the things that Lego Serious Play does well. It involves play. It allows creating these representations in the world that we can then project onto and understand differently. So it's the artistic creative process that you start to get to is very different than an analytic process. And I think enormously important if we actually want to achieve real strategic growth.
I want to jump in and say, having been to temples and um, using exercises in my classrooms here in Silicon Valley that are about that, I will share a few classroom exercises in this session later that you can take to your classroom about how to bring it into strategy as practice in an MBA classroom. But I'm going to also suggest that we read all the questions or ask all the comments first, and then instead of responding to each one, find the themes to address them, because Ravi's theme linked closely to what Charlie asked about, if there is a chapter that sheds light on the intersection of art and spirituality. And then Raphael asked, what can aesthetics teach us for ethical decision making and for interpersonal relationships? He thinks that those are arguably the three dimensions that are intrinsically human and that these can't be outsourced to AI. Um, and Marty, you've been very patient. Your comment, and then Jim Stoner. Good to see you, Jim.
Well, I just wanted to add, I'm completely on board with Steve and Matt in this topic. I wasn't as a young psychologist. I was pretty analytical. As you know, scholarly psychology has to do with uh, scientific method and all the kinds of pressures. But after marrying an artist and having several children who are artists and see how they approach the world very differently at times than I did, I began to explore how important it was in our development as a species, all these things you're talking about, which is sensory input and experience. And then I started reading about the great changes of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And I came upon the fact that when the printing press came out, less than 15% of the population could read. But where did they get their information? Where did they get their enlightenment? At community meetings, dances, concerts, all kinds of plays in the public sphere. This is where they got their information. And we never talked about that in the scholarly environment. We only talked about all these mostly men that wrote articles. And there are so many contributions by people that were in the sensory domain and in the artistic community. So I think that's changing. And you've alluded to it with AI in some way, and even CGI, which is you can make images now very easily. And I'm very curious about how this is going to impact our world, particularly as so many young people headed towards university are not interested in going to university. They think it is, in some ways, a bankrupt system. So I think we're onto something that is another path. and I want to just support your work and say I'm on board.
Jim?
Thank you. I two things. I hope we get a chance to listen to Matt play Uncle Marcellus or sing Uncle Marcellus, but we don't know if we'll have time to squeeze that one in. The second one may be equally orthogonal to what we're doing, what we're talking about. Do you all have any comments about jazz as an access to understanding and dealing with what we're struggling with right now? At the moment, I'm finding it something I keep thinking about, including Frank Barrett's book, Yes to the Mess. Any thoughts about looking at what's going on with us in terms of jazz?
Are there more we want to get out, or can we start responding?
I think we have enough comments. We can start responding, and I say +1 to listening to some music. So, Matt, pressure, pressure, pressure.
I just want to say, in terms of jazz, there were 2 chapters in this book we didn't do because the people agreed to, but then ran out of time and couldn't get them done. One of them was Frank Barrett, who was going to take on. I asked Frank very specifically. I provoked him because he said provoking is important in Yes to the Mess. So I provoked him to write about his own practice as a program director at Case Western, and in terms of his guidelines of saying yes to mess of jazz, how good was he at actually approaching management as that leadership as jazz? And he said someday he'd write that someday, but he didn't manage to get in time for this. And the other one was actually the other side of music was Ian Sutherland, who's a stout, good choral conductor and is now president at Mount Allison University in Canada. And we would ask Ian to do the same thing, to write about leadership from his perspective as a musician. And he also was too busy being president of Mount Allison to manage to get it written. But I think there's so I say too, I think there's a lot there. There's a lot of stuff. I think I was consistently, and I think you see this message throughout all the chapters, that management and leadership have an awful lot more to learn from the arts than the arts do from management and leadership.
Thank you.
And Steve, can you also answer the question about if there is a chapter at the intersection of art and spirituality?
There is one about art and mindfulness that starts to get there, that Donatella's piece starts to get there, talking about mindfulness. And I think it starts to get into spirituality. And there's I think there's actually quite a bit of room to work here. I've been starting to use the phrase discernment quite a bit, as I think this idea of aesthetic judgment is fundamentally about something that I think of as discernment. I think of discernment as an artistic way. But if you look at the literature, discernment is almost always talked about in terms of theological way. And if you Googled discernment and leadership, you would get there's one program in the world that I found that actually talks about discernment for leadership, and it's run out of the Vatican by a David McCollum, a friend of mine, because discernment is a term of art in a lot of theology. And there's something very common there about them, there's something about, so when you say spirituality, I think when you get to a depth of practice, there's practical things that I think I think there's some real commonality things there that aren't talked about very often as being very similar, but I think they are. That I've been actually trying to have some discussions. I've been having some discussions recently with the woman who became dean after I was interim dean, Deborah Jackson, who's written books on leadership, but also is a reverend. And there's a lot there that's very common that hasn't been talked about a lot. I think in depth of practice, whether you talk about, like, in the theological term would tend to be formation, whereas in leadership I would talk about development. That there's this discernment versus maybe aesthetic judgment. I think there's a lot there that's just remarkably similar.
I want to add to that by saying that my professor at Stanford, who's known as the father of decision analysis, Professor Ron Howard, taught us decision analysis with discernment and making distinctions between less good, and ethical choices in how you apply decision analysis in the world focused heavily on discernment. And, when you were talking about judgment, and let's bring judgment back, I was thinking, oh, Ron used to say discernment, because if judgment, some people want to stay away from being judged and think it's harsh. Discernment is actually a valuable quality because it helps you choose what decision you want to go with. And that brings me to, you want to address the question about how aesthetics teaches aesthetic ethical decision making and anything about interpersonal relationships?
I go right back to like what Donna Ladkin would say, and Donna actually also didn't write a chapter for us, even though we wanted her to. But she talks about, like, her the big thing about ethics is, how do you even know there's an ethical decision to make? And the ethical problems tend to be from the situations like Denny Joya and the exploding Pintos, going, I didn't even think of it in terms of ethics. I just was making a decision. So how do I discern what's really going on? And she talks a lot about discerning that in fact, there's what are the ethical issues involved here. And I think that's, and I talk now, when I talk to my students, I said, discernment is the fundamental issue for leaders, that it is fundamentally, can you figure out, are you actually seeing something real and important that's useful? Or you see something real and important that's not at all useful or important? Or are you just seeing your own projection of your own crap on the world? We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what our own crap is, so we could at least identify when maybe we're seeing that, rather than seeing something real out there. But how do I know? That's, to me, the essence of discernment. How do I know whether it's real, or whether it's just my stuff, or what? And I think that's and part of that discernment has to be like, what are the ethical issues? How do I balance?
Well, and let me jump in there, Steve, because the question, framing it as ethical decision making, it recalls not Ron Howard. It was somebody, I can't remember the name of the person, came and gave us a presentation. This is probably 10 years ago at Stern. Somebody from Carnegie Mellon, who was then programming the systems that were going to be involved with the driverless cars, right? And so the ethical problem for the designers of driverless cars is basically the trolley problem. The train is on the track. Are you going to, divert this way and hurt these people, or this way and hurt those people? And the engineers at Carnegie Mellon had decided that the only way to address that particular thing that would not ultimately bring liability back to them as designers of systems was to program in a moment of randomness, a moment of undecidability, something, we're just going to make the system do something random in that moment. And that sort of shows the limits of all approaches to ethics that think of them in terms of utility maximization, or in terms of rule following, or whatever else. But again, that moment of undecidability, I think that's where the ethics and the aesthetics and the spirituality actually converge. There's no system, there's no computational, there's no algorithm that's going to solve for what is spiritually good, what is ethically good, what is aesthetically beautiful, or impactful in some other way. And again, my own work these days, I've got my head in a revise and resubmit where we're trying to write about Kierkegaard and Simone de Beauvoir, where that fundamental experience of ambiguity is ethics. It's not necessarily about the decision that then creates value or adheres to some rule. Like, ethical value is in the moment of undecidability, or the experience of ambiguity. And then, Steve, to your point, to sit in that moment and then to realize it's not just some undifferentiated one thing. Oh, wow, there's many things. And what is to be discerned or perceived as what is important in that moment? That's then, I think, where it really starts to open up, for Kierkegaard at least, I would say, and then for scholars of ethical decision making and personal interaction. Raphael, I mean, this is your question. Like, it's as simple as what do you say in response to any one thing that any one other person has said? It's never truly clear. There's always a moment of and so to just accept that that's part of it, and to not always reach for some kind of right answer or some kind of optimization solution. I think that's part of what the field of organizational aesthetics is interested in. I think it's philosophically interesting too And maybe indeed, as you suggest, that is what I mean. The bots, the AI, they are pattern recognition and pattern extension mechanisms. They are not pattern creation mechanisms. They're not attuned to what in the pattern doesn't adhere to the pattern, the noise in the signal. And that may be what is sort of left, hopefully, and hopefully productively, and even I would add joyfully to us as humans, to sort of engage with that ambiguity. I don't know.
Arunika, and then Ken, I'd like you to make your comment.
Oh, thank you. Here's my experiences through my research site. Couple of months ago, I went to a milk company in Tokyo, and then I knew interesting story coming out of the company. Milk company CEO was a medical doctor, and then turned out to be he was promoted to a CEO of the milk company because the company was a family business, and then the CEO regularly take a full shot, give full shot to almost all employees. The, when I ask an employee, the manager in the company, almost all of them say, yeah, the moment I feel happiness and joy because CEO, the needle of the CEO put into my arm, and then so they feel, oh yes, we are a company, and so when I listen to the story from the company, yes, the beauty or value or spirituality could be emergent property between the person A and person B. So, like the vaccine shot from the CEO, that moment, the 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 spirituality emerged in two persons. That's my experience. That's my idea of. I would say it seems to be affordance in human machine interfaces. Could be the affordance idea could be similar to discussion. Here's my comment.
Ken, that for me, to talk about affordances is then to open up and raise the questions about transhumanism or posthumanism that have been explored philosophically. I don't know what the discourse in this group has been about that, but I would assert, just to have a claim, that the AI has no awareness of itself, much less of we or of others. By contrast, this Christmas tree, I think this Christmas tree that's standing here, it's chopped off, but it's aware of itself. I think the dog is aware of it. Like, is awareness, is consciousness ambient in the world, the real world, not the mechanistic, world of the bots. I think the affordance, the degree to which some kind of like beyond just the human, do we say post-human or transhuman? Again, this gets very spiritual very quickly. But I think that's another aspect of what we're here calling aesthetics and flagging as its relevance to organization. Steve, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, thank you for that, Ken, because you brought in, felt me, a much more relational perspective. And I've found myself trapped in this my very American non-relational perspective, individualist perspective sort of thing. And I think relationality and connection is actually also essential in aesthetics. But there's, in addition to this idea of being based in sensory knowing, there's also these ideas that go back to like Rafael Ramirez's work and Bateson about aesthetics being about connection and connection between people. And to me, that's an important part of the field and an enormous amount of what it is to be human. And what matters in terms of humanistic management, connection is to me everything. And I think aesthetics actually recognizes that much more so, and it's much more concerned with it.
Thank you. We're at the last 5 minutes, and I promised Ravi I would share an exercise I use in class. So this is the chapel at St. Mary's College where I teach, and I march my students. This was a virtual class during COVID when I said to them, okay, find, a place on campus that resonates with you and bring back an image of it. And they found these different images. If we had talked about it and just said, what's your favorite place? All 4 students who brought these images back would have said, oh, the chapel is their favorite place. But by picking very different images of the chapel, they were able to talk about it differently as to the quiet meditative space or the celebration space where people gather for ritual versus the beautiful architecture of the place. And that leads to a discussion about strategy. When we talk about vision and strategy, how, if you only leave it to words, everybody interprets that vision differently. But if you add the aesthetic elements to it, then it helps you align everybody to the vision that you really have. So when we talk about vision as part of the strategy course, I've often in person classes, I march them into our museum and have them experience the museum and bring back their favorite image from the museum and talk about that as their vision or rigorously subjective vision. Another classroom exercise I've used was, my strategy course is the last one in the MBA cohort, and they've all been together. I'm the only new person in the room in the first day of class. And I learned from a previous instructor that there were some serious team issues in that class that I was going to walk into, and literally like borderline going to court about disputes within the classroom. And to walk into that as the new person expecting them to do teamwork, I didn't know how to make sure that this wouldn't erupt in this final course that I teach. But like kindergartners, I can't set rules of behavior because they're working adults, they're 40 years old. So I walked in with 2 paintings and I held them up in my first class as part of my introduction. And one was this, and the other one was this. And they're same colors, made similarly, but they're very different paintings. And without saying that your class has issues or you're not getting along, I just held up the two and said, what would you like the class norms to be? And would you like it to be like this painting or like that mandala painting? And voluntarily, they all preferred less chaotic and more orderly. And we agreed that this would be our class norm. And that helped me get through preventing the eruptions in class about, students doing things that sometimes happen in interpersonal relationships. So, on that note, I want to use the last minute to say thank you so much. Sorry, Matt, we didn't get to hear you play the oboe. I promised that I shared the organizational aesthetics link journal earlier. There is a music special issue, there's a dance special issue. I know I did the poetry one. You will find lots of good material. And you now know how to reach Steve and Matt, and you have the handbook to look forward to. We really appreciate your spending this time with us and having this enriching discussion. Thanks again to International Humanistic Management Association, to Ariane, to Jim Stoner, and all of you. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Matt, for enriching us all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Pleasure.